Hi everyone, I'm filming here today at a new location. This is the Royal Australian Air Force Museum that's located about 27 kilometres southwest of Melbourne in the suburb of Point Cook. The airbase here at Point Cook is the birthplace of the Royal Australian Air Force, or the RAAF as we call it, and the base was established here in 1913 when it started serving as the first central flying school for training pilots. So I'm here taking some footage of the museum's example of the P-40E, which you can see here and which I'm going to be talking about today, and its service that it performed in the early months of the war in the Pacific with the RAAF. Now the P-40 was used in many theatres by many different air forces. It was one of the most widely used aircraft of World War II. However, it had a particular role to play with the RAAF in the early parts of the war in the Pacific. So today I'll be calling this aircraft the P-40E the Kittyhawk, which was the name that was used by the British and Commonwealth forces. In the US Army Air Force, it was called the Warhawk. This same model was called the Warhawk in the US. So apologies if I'm confusing any US viewers by calling it the Kittyhawk. So of course, Australia was involved in World War II from its very beginnings in Europe, and Australians had flown with the RAF in the Battle of Britain, as did pilots from many Commonwealth nations. And Australia itself stood up a number of RAAF squadrons that were deployed into the Mediterranean and North African theatre to support Commonwealth operations there. From May 1941, pilots in those theatres began to transition to using the P-40 Tomahawk that had started to be supplied to the British under lend-lease. In particular, No. 3 Squadron and No. 450 Squadron of the RAAF had been trained in Australia and were operating in the Mediterranean theatre, and had started to use these P-40s, which they used for much of the war there. Now, when Japan entered World War II on the 7th of December 1941, the RAAF in mainland Australia had little to no combat aircraft and very few trained pilots. The US Navy was trying to regain its balance after being knocked about at Pearl Harbor, and the Philippines had fallen, and so the US military was effectively knocked down for the first few months of the war. Singapore fell in February 1942, Java in Indonesia fell on March 9th, 1942, and the Japanese were landing in different parts of Indonesia, in Rabaul on January 23rd, and in Lae on the north coast of New Guinea on March 8th. And so the Japanese appeared to be everywhere all at once, and Australia was facing the prospect of being cut off from its supply lines to the west coast of the US. So with the main RAAF fighter units deployed in the Mediterranean, and no pilots and no aircraft, the Australian government pleaded to be sent fighter aircraft for air defence, and was eventually supplied with 75 credited P-40s that had originally been assigned to the Dutch East Indies, but these were urgently diverted to Sydney once the Dutch surrendered in early March. So aircrew from the RAAF assembled the first 25 of these Kittyhawks, and they were originally ferried up to Townsville in Australia's far north, in our tropical zone, where the 75th Squadron was stood up on March 4th, 1942. So this was an all-new squadron which had been formed and was using all-new aircraft. Now the squadron was only allowed 9 days to train with the P-40E before it was deployed to Port Moresby in New Guinea, with its first personnel arriving on March 17th and the first aircraft arriving on the 21st. And on that March 21st, they were immediately put into action and shot down a Japanese bomber that was performing a reconnaissance mission over Port Moresby. And so for the next 44 days, the 75th Squadron was the only RAAF flying unit that was conducting missions out of New Guinea, and they sought to defend southern New Guinea from Japanese dominance. Now this resistance blunted Japanese air superiority ahead of the Battle of the Coral Sea that took place in early May 1942, and that was a determined effort by the Japanese to mount amphibious landings at Port Moresby. The failure of these landings ultimately forced the Japanese to seek an overland route to Port Moresby that resulted in the Kokoda campaign from July to November 1942. So that 44 days, that 6 weeks of operation, effectively destroyed the 75th Squadron. And by early May 1942, they were exhausted and had to be pulled back to Townsville in Australia to refit. During that time, that 44 days, they destroyed 39 enemy aircraft and had damaged another 54 for the loss of 12 pilots and 24 of their aircraft. They'd flown in some pretty atrocious conditions from makeshift airstrips, and the pilots were often flying ill with malaria and dysentery and other tropical diseases, and they were up against a seasoned enemy that was flying the lightweight and manoeuvrable A6M-0. The P-40E was outclassed in dogfights by the Zero because of the Zero's ability to outturn and outclimb the P-40. Australian pilots quickly learned that it was suicidal to try and outturn a Zero at low dogfighting speeds, and so they turned to using dive and climb tactics to beat the Japanese. But despite these apparent dogfighting drawbacks, the pilots of the 75th spoke highly of the P-40E. They liked its ruggedness, they liked its ability to operate from rough airstrips, they appreciated its heavy armament of 650 caliber machine guns, the armor plating that it had for the pilots, and its self-sealing fuel tanks that gave it robustness in air combat. They also liked the robustness of the Ellison V1710 piston engine and its ability to be operated at high revs for long periods of time. The aircraft could carry a 500-pound bomb on the centerline and 200-pound bombs on the wings. Now, after the 75th Squadron had been refit in Townsville, and after receiving some experienced Spitfire pilots that had been repatriated from Europe, it was deployed to join the newly formed 76th Squadron at Milne Bay in New Guinea, and it arrived there on July 31st, 1942. So there was 2 squadrons then operating out of Milne Bay, both fitted with the P-40Es. And throughout August and September, these 2 squadrons defended Port Moresby and were critical in defeating Japanese naval landings at Milne Bay in late August, which were ultimately finally defeated on the 7th of September. Now, the aircraft that's shown here, Ming the Merciless, is painted in the livery of the 76th Squadron. This actual aircraft, serial number A2990, took part in the Battle of Milne Bay with the 75th Squadron, and it also had the RAAF's first confirmed victory over Milne Bay when its pilot, Flying Officer Peter Ash, shot down a Japanese Zero on August 4th, 1942. And so in the early days of World War II in the Pacific, it was the P-40E Kittyhawk operating with the 75th and 76th Squadron of the RAAF that did all the heavy lifting in terms of confronting the Japanese as they tried to invade southern New Guinea. That's why here at the museum we have a restored version of the P-40E, along with other aircraft that the Australian Air Force flew, such as the Spitfire in Europe and also the Mustang later in the war. But despite its on-paper shortcomings compared to the Zero, this aircraft earned a lot of love from the pilots who flew it and has a special place in the history of the RAAF. So let's talk a little bit about the particulars of the P-40E. So it was armed with 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, which was an increase of 2 over the D model of the aircraft, which was fitted with 4. It could carry a 500-pound bomb on its fuselage centerline for ground and shipping attack, and also 2 100-pound bombs on the wings. Had a top speed of 582 km per hour at 15,000 feet, and could cruise at 378 km per hour. The engine was of Ellison V1710-39, which was a liquid-cooled V12 engine delivering 846 kilowatts. Had a surface ceiling of 29,000 feet and a range of 1,078 kilometers. Now, later versions of the P-40 were fitted with the superior US Packard V1650 Milne engine that gave better performance at higher altitudes than the Ellison that was in the E model. All P-40s were built at the Curtiss-Wright Buffalo factory in New York. Total production was 13,738 aircraft across all variants, with around 2,320 being the P-40Es like this one here. And of those 2,320, about 1,500 were supplied to the British and Commonwealth forces. So it was used widely by the US Army Air Force, and was also supplied to many allies of the Americans, including Commonwealth forces. So I hope you enjoyed me discussing this display here at the Royal Australian Air Force Museum, and I appreciate you getting to the end of the video and listening to me bang on about this aircraft. I look forward to talking to you soon about another armoured vehicle or artillery piece or aircraft, and until then, I hope that you stay well. Thank you.